Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kim Turner. I'm one of the Vice Presidents of AUSI New South Wales. I'd just like to say a few words by way of introduction to our next session, which will focus more on, specifically on AUKUS, a year on. On the 16th of September 2021, and just over 1 year ago, morning television programs were interrupted by a telecast with the leaders of Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, then Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson and Joe Biden, announcing the creation of a new trilateral security partnership to be called AUKUS. In this auditorium, about 2 months ago, I listened to the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, describe that decision as the biggest decision that any Australian government had made in decades, stressing the importance of personal relationships between leaders and giving full credit to Scott Morrison for picking up the phone and driving the initiative. A lot has happened since that announcement, not the least of which is that of the three leaders that announced AUKUS just over a year ago, only one, President Biden, remains in office. So what might this mean for the future of AUKUS? In framing the terms of reference for the Defence Strategic Review, as Her Excellency mentioned, the Australian Government has recognised that the world is undergoing a significant strategic realignment, and that military modernisation, technological disruption and the risk of state-on-state conflict are complicating Australia's strategic circumstances. The trends identified in previous Defence White Papers, as has been noted, have been accelerating at a rate much faster than anticipated, such that we can no longer plan on a decade of warning. Will AUKUS enable us to meet that challenge? At the time of the AUKUS announcement, the focus and much of the media was on the decision to deliver a conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine. But of no less importance is the second line of effort, the effort to share technology to develop and provide joint advanced capabilities to enable the delivery of capability within much shorter timeframes than the very long wait for the acquisition of a nuclear-powered submarine. For example, the development of an Australian long-range strike capability. Our next three speakers from academia and industry will help us to explore some of these issues, look at what progress has been made and whether 1 year on AUKUS is living up to expectations. And as we move from the consultation phase to the implementation phase of the AUKUS partnership, what prospects there might be. I'll ask each of our speakers to present, but we'll hold any questions until the panel session that will immediately follow, when there will be an opportunity to ask all of our speakers, including some of our service representatives, questions. So first up, I'd just like to introduce Mr. Thomas Corben. Now, the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney is a university-based research centre which is dedicated to the analysis of American foreign policy, economics, politics and culture. And we're very pleased to have Mr. Thomas Corben from the United States Studies Centre as the first of our three speakers for this part of the seminar. Tom Corben is a Research Fellow in the Foreign Policy and Defence program at the Studies Centre. He was previously a Resident Fellow with the Pacific Forum in Hawaii, where he focused on Japanese and Korean politics and foreign policy and Australia's engagement with Northeast Asia. Tom has commented and written widely on these issues for a range of platforms, including the Australian Financial Review, The Strategist and others. Tom's particular areas of expertise are US-Asia relations and US foreign policy, defence and strategy, and I welcome him to the podium today to give his insights into the AUKUS relationship. Thanks.
Look, thanks very much for that kind introduction. And it's really a privilege to be here. I don't want to spend too much time going over some of the notable advances step by step that we've seen over the last year in AUKUS, because those may become apparent during the course of my remarks and they've been referred to by our distinguished speakers before me. But nor do I simply want to admire or analyse the promise or the problem or problems that AUKUS presents for Australia in greater detail, but it seems to me that a year on, perhaps we have more questions than answers, or perhaps more challenges than closures. This applies both to the new challenges and to the opportunities for the alliance that AUKUS presents, but also to the spectre of past efforts to bypass or disassemble long-standing obstacles to defence industrial technology cooperation, let alone integration, within the Australia-US alliance. And based on my reading of AUKUS-related developments this year and a series of conversations I've been fortunate to have with officials and experts far more knowledgeable on this matter than I am, there are 5, maybe 6, we'll see how we go for time, points that I think are worth raising about the present and the future of AUKUS at this 1-year mark. Point 1. AUKUS is a useful signal, but it's not yet a game changer. Might be controversial to say so, but for all the positive steps that Australia, the UK and the US have taken so far, AUKUS is not yet a game changer. In fact, it is very little right now, at least if we talk in terms of tangibles that most of us in this room are allowed to see. I don't say this lightly or as a potshot at what are in reality quite difficult conversations that need to be had and complex processes that need to be navigated. Nor is this to ignore the progress that has been made, particularly on the submarine front, especially the signing of the Information Sharing Agreement on nuclear propulsion technologies. In fact, I would argue that such developments tell a very positive story about the overall direction of America's overall regional strategy and its approach to modernising its key regional alliances. As I've argued in several pieces with my colleagues from the Study Centre, this combination of information sharing and capability building under AUKUS is perhaps among the best examples of the Joe Biden administration's willingness to empower its close allies and partners to both meet their own security needs, but also simultaneously to be better defence partners for the United States. This empowerment has 2 distinct types of kind or pathways, something that my colleague Peter Lee and I refer to as a 2-step approach to alliance modernisation. The first involves stepping out of the way of allies helping themselves. This has involved removing often outdated Cold War era regulations or restrictions designed to influence or outright block allies and partners from developing or procuring certain kinds of military capabilities. In other words, taking a more hands-off approach to allied and partner force-structured decision-making. The best example of this that I can think of, in the Indo-Pacific at least, is the decision last year to remove the last vestiges of the 1979 US-Korea ballistic missile guidelines. The second, and in my view, much more difficult type of empowerment involves stepping in to help allies and partners access advanced defence technologies and platforms, and to streamline cooperation on future capabilities, usually through existing mechanisms and frameworks designed for this purpose. Empowerment Type 2 is the most relevant for Australia. Indeed, AUKUS is the best example we have of this approach today. As we know, aside from supporting Australian submarine procurement, AUKUS is also intended to foster trilateral cooperation on a wider range of defence science, technology, industrial and capability development projects. This was, of course, possible before AUKUS came into being. But the signals we can see here and elsewhere in the region, with the likes of Japan, for example, suggest that the US is at least cognizant that it cannot retain its military technological edge on its own any longer. In that sense, AUKUS dovetails with existing efforts to expand bilateral and trilateral alliance cooperation through the US National Technology and Industrial Base, or NTIB. Well, dovetails? Subsumes? Don't really know yet. Because as one of its chief architects remarked to me recently, the NTIB has failed to deliver on its promise of greater integration and access for top-tier allies like Australia to critical US industrial technological inputs and outputs. AUKUS hasn't changed that simply by coming into being. This word promise brings me back to my point about the semantics of what AUKUS is versus what it ought to be, or what any of the parties involved, mind you, believe it is intended to achieve at the end of the day. I say that AUKUS is not a some say because so much commentary over the last year has chosen, whether consciously or unconsciously, to describe AUKUS as something when it is not yet proven to be. Game changers, in my opinion, can only be called as much once they have meaningfully changed the game. Saying that AUKUS is a technological accelerator, an industrial integrator, a commercial agreement, a vessel for delivering advanced US capabilities to Australia at a higher speed, or anything to that effect, will only be true after it is self-evident. This may seem just like semantic nitpicking, but I make this point only to stress that AUKUS still has a long way to go to reach its potential in any of the ways that people have spoken about or are thinking through at the moment. Point 2. If we didn't know already, I think we've learned that the United States really does trust Australia with its most protected secrets. The implication is that when this debate next surfaces within the context of technology sharing within the alliance context, it should be treated for the red herring that it really is. US officials have frequently balked at the idea of sharing their country's most sensitive military technological secrets with even the closest of allies like Australia, worrying about insufficiencies or inadequacies for the protection of advanced defence technological IP, and among other things. Part of this stems from a superpower mindset or culture, which understandably has compelled the United States to protect these secrets not only for the sake of its own military technology edge over would-be adversaries, but also for the Cold War era purposes of conflict mitigation and minimization, including, as I just mentioned before, by restraining Allied access to said technologies. At the same time, in Australia's case at least, the US shares sensitive intelligence by default with Australia and its other Five Eyes partners. We're also now one of only 2 countries to share in the secrets of US origin nuclear propulsion technology, something with those involved in the execution of AUKUS have been at pains to stress as a major coup. On top of that, we operate and look after many other advanced US origin military systems, F-35s, P-8s, Tridents, you name them. In a part of the world where the risks of miscalculation and potentially conflict have grown significantly, with the implication that defence industrial technological secrets contained within these assets could be lost in the process of a conflict or confrontation. I think there's quiet recognition amongst key thinkers in the US that this contradiction is no longer sustainable. Indeed, it's not all that uncommon to hear officials stress that whatever it is that Australia has asked of the United States when it comes to defence industry and defence technology, we have almost inevitably received it, and this is true. Not to be petty, but this is also to say something of the leakiness of the United States' own defence industrial complex today when it comes to industrial espionage. Take submarine secrets, hypersonics, you name it. Take a report from the Washington Post last month, which noted that a wide range of Chinese military research organisations, many on the US entity list, had been acquiring troves of advanced US software products, more than 300 sales from around 50 companies of things like aeronautical engineering software since 2019, in fact, with dual-use applications to fill critical gaps in the PLA's own weapons programs. These software products were produced by US companies whose research has been funded by millions, if not billions, of Pentagon dollars. The Export Control Reform Act of 2018 and accounting obligations for US firms notwithstanding, these technologies made their way into the hands of the Chinese Academy of Aerospace Aerodynamics, or CAAA. And CAAA was instrumental in the design of China's 2021 hypersonic missile test, the one likened by US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, as a Sputnik moment. The point here is that if there's any smartening up to be done across the alliance, it's by all parties, and not just by the junior alliance partner. In other words, it should not be incumbent on Australia to, time and again, have to stress our trustworthiness to the United States. This should be about all sides working together to identify a select range of technologies and their critical inputs that require extra protection, to work together to ensure that the protections for these technologies are appropriately robust, but also to ensure that our efforts to protect these inputs do not compromise our efforts to foster more seamless cooperation amongst a trusted community. We need protections on all sides of the pond, be that across the Atlantic or the Pacific, to share and protect technologies in the way that some of us hope that AUKUS will enable us to do so. Point 3. I believe that Pillar 1, submarines, will almost certainly work out in the sense that we will eventually get our full complement. But there's no guarantee that they will be the most dominant military platform in the oceans of the Indo-Pacific by the time we have the full complement online. Hence, with its emphasis on delivering both near-term capabilities in the next 5 years and building advantages in technology over time that will define the battle space in the years ahead, Pillar 2 of AUKUS, whichever way you look at it, is in my view the most critical. As I mentioned earlier, it's no small thing that the US has given Australia access to the crown jewels of its defence technological treasure trove. And it's the fact that Washington has done this before that gives me enough confidence to believe that in some way, shape or form, Australia's fleet of SSNs will eventually come into the service of the RAN. What is less clear is what kind of operational, let alone strategic environment, these boats will take to the water in. My colleague Dr. Peter Lee laid this out rather strikingly in an AFR op-ed earlier this year. He wrote, "For better or worse, quote, AUKUS will ultimately be judged by whether the submarine endeavour succeeds or fails. But that 2050, quote, is a long way into the future to base defence planning, a completely different world in many respects." To really give a sense of the timelines that we're talking about here, Dr. Lee wrote that, and quote again, "The time before the last Australian SSN is commissioned will be similar to the time just elapsed between the present day and the Hawke government's defence white paper of 1987. That was a time when the US was undisputedly the dominant military power in Asia, when China was in the midst of a re-emergence after years of internal strife, and when India's economy was roughly on par with Australia's. In short, 35 years later, the strategic environment is radically different. And this is to say that by 2050, what might controversially be called legacy systems by then, like surface ships, combat aircraft, or armoured vehicles, will have either been made redundant or reimagined to work alongside artificial intelligence and unmanned systems, or so many technologists would posit. This is the world in which the AUKUS partnership must be able to deliver nuclear-powered submarines that advance defence's strategic objectives, which may very well evolve themselves over this same timeframe. Needless to say, the pace of change in the anti-submarine warfare enterprise will be of particular interest here, given the proliferation of unmanned systems, quantum computing, AI, and etc. The point here is not to suggest that submarines won't be useful military platforms. Much like the future strategic environment, it's hard to predict exactly how emerging technologies will develop, or whether they will deliver on their promise at all, even if it's unhelpfully easy to say that they will fundamentally change how we do things. Rather, it is more to say that we cannot know for certain that the dominance that is frequently attributed to these vessels today will hold true between now and 2050, and that we can't rely on the delivery of AUKUS Pillar 1 alone to constitute success. That, of course, means putting greater stock, as I said, into AUKUS Pillar 2 to deliver what Australia needs not just before 2027, within the 5-year time frame, but out to 2050. It's also no coincidence then that things like AI, quantum and unmanned systems all appear on the advanced capabilities list. Point 4. We're already encountering the same legal, policy and regulatory hurdles to defence technology and industrial collaboration that we've dealt with for several decades. In other words, we don't yet have the optimal architecture to facilitate cooperation at the speed of relevance. Without this, in my view, there's a risk that AUKUS might accelerate certain things, but it won't diversify or multiply in the way that we hope it will. Here, of course, I'm mostly talking about the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, or ITAR, which governs exports of defence equipment and technologies, but I'm also talking about the Export Administration Regulations, or EAR, which cover potential or verified dual-use equivalents. The USSC has published quite extensively on this and related issues, and I would encourage you to engage with those publications if you haven't already. But to briefly sum up for purposes here, the ITAR problem is 2 or 3-fold for Australia, depending on how you look at this. 1, ITAR does not discriminate between allies and other generic recipients of US military sales, which effectively equates Australia with Latvia. 2, ITAR is extraterritorial in its application, meaning that if knowledge or a product is labelled under ITAR at the R&D stage through the involvement of a US person or entity anywhere in the world, it is controlled under US defence export controls through its entire product life cycle permanently. And 3, this taint effect is not limited to defence technologies alone. It is further fragmented through dual-use items which are administered by the US Department of Commerce through EAR, as I mentioned earlier, and include technologies as diverse as propulsion systems and microorganisms. According to experts like Dr. William Greenwald, this means that dual-use and generally unclassified technologies are generally more at risk of ITAR taint than those that are classified. The way ITAR rules and regulations currently work, it would only take a United States engineer deciding that they wanted red rather than blue hubcaps on, say, their Australian-made teaming UAV, for example, for this to become ITAR incumbent, and therefore subject to often arduous and repetitive application processes for exemptions. It's not that relevant parts of the US system don't recognise that this problem set is an issue for Australia. As Secretary Lloyd Austin's foreword in the recently released National Defence Strategy stated, business as usual at the Department of Defence is no longer acceptable. At the time of its announcement, my colleagues and I believed when we wrote that Joe Biden's embrace of AUKUS on primetime television signalled, quote, presidential support for empowering close allies through defence industry cooperation, including the necessary and attendant reforms. But the solicitation of input from Australia on the nature and the location of the problems within the US system notwithstanding, the reality is that 1 year into AUKUS, even with executive level buy-in on day one, Australia finds itself bumping up against the same roadblocks we've come to recognise, not to love. Unfortunately, it seems as though this signal from Joe Biden on primetime television was not enough to galvanise the system into action, particularly at the State Department, where many experts, other than myself, tend to agree that most of the regulatory, political and cultural barriers to export control reform reside. In short, an unreformed US defence export control regime is one of the biggest barriers to alliance integration, whether that is through NTIB or whether that is through AUKUS. The barriers remain much the same as when my former colleague and friend Brendan Thomas Noon wrote of the NTIB in 2019, quote, bureaucratic fragmentation, failure to treat trusted allies differently from other partners, and leaders' reluctance to attempt politically costly reform. These are all still factors today. And as William Greenwald, who I mentioned earlier, who, by the way, is a chief architect of the NTIB reform that saw Australia added, noted more recently, AUKUS as a concept may be dead in the water until ITAR is addressed and reformed. So what do we do? It really depends on the nature of the reforms within the US system that Australia seeks to achieve, on what timeline and at what depth. If this is simply about accelerating and streamlining processes through which Australia acquires advanced military capabilities from the US, and perhaps expanding that enterprise to encompass maintaining, sustaining, and perhaps even manufacturing specific components of those capabilities, or niche capabilities themselves, and if we accept that some level of ITAR taint will remain, but the process will simply work faster, I have greater confidence that we can work this out with Washington in a reasonably short time frame. If this is the ask, effectively light touches to the system to give Australia greater preferential treatment without a major restructure, then I'm fairly certain the submarines will work out. The US knows what it's giving away, it has some idea of what it means to let a close ally into the tent or to peek under the hood. Accelerating delivery through positive discrimination, as I've called it, and some deeper level of industrial integration through supply chain distribution are arguably easier for the United States to countenance, perhaps because there is scope for it to remain the undisputed senior partner and in control of some of the most important IP involved. But if the AUKUS enterprise is about Australia securing reforms that allow the US and Australia, and let's not forget the United Kingdom, to pool their engineering and their science and technology resources to develop the next generation of defence capabilities together from step one, or from having what my colleague and good friend Ashley Townsend had referred to as the shared Google Doc model for collaboration, then this is a far bigger ask and will probably require more widespread reforms. This, to me, quite clearly is the biggest hurdle when it comes to realising AUKUS Pillar 2 in the way that I think most in this room and most across Australia who look at this topic would agree. Failing this more widespread reform, my fear is that while AUKUS might end up accelerating some capabilities for Australia, our ability to innovate collectively will remain highly constrained, and we will be unable to do so at the speed of relevance without navigating reams of regulations or without allowing non-US companies to retain their valuable intellectual property. In either case, the key variable is speed. Whether it's acquiring known capabilities from the US or designing new ones from scratch, we need to do faster. In terms of what to do about this, I can't claim to have all the right answers, although I've heard plenty of suggestions about the best approach to forcing change within the US system. I'm also pleased to say that Dr. Greenwald, who I mentioned earlier, is writing a report for the USSC as we speak on this exact topic, and that should come out early next year. During the panel discussion, though, I'd be happy to offer some placeholder suggestions. My last point, because I know I'm running out of time, is that the ITAR conundrum also means that Australia needs to do some serious thinking about what sovereignty actually looks like through AUKUS and through the upgraded US alliance more broadly, particularly when it comes to defence industry and tech cooperation. Because how Australia defines sovereignty will determine whether we seek to use AUKUS as a battering ram or as a surgical scalpel when it comes to alliance management, but particularly when it comes to export control reform issues, onshoring production for priority capabilities, and protecting Australian intellectual property. Sovereignty is not a blanket concept for Australia to throw over AUKUS writ large, in my view. It is not a black or white proposition. Realistically, it's probably going to look different depending on the capability program in question and at what time and timeline we're talking about. AUKUS notwithstanding, Australia remains in a situation where the best we can hope for is bounded or selective sovereignty, at least when it comes to defence, industrial and technology cooperation, in my view. Australia will never be able to do everything on its own when it comes to developing, producing and maintaining our most high-end defence capabilities. It therefore falls to questions of the degree of integration that we seek, and by extension, the degree of sovereignty that we are willing to give up, as much as the degree of sovereignty we are seeking to achieve. It logically flows that it's incumbent on us to know which parts of the various defence supply chains or innovation networks in which Australia has substantial equities are worthy of investment or attention, both financially and politically. The previous and current governments in Australia already seem to know this. Take Defence Minister Richard Marles' comments recently on his trip to the United States, where he stressed on multiple occasions that Australia's intention is to supplement the US defence industrial base and its critical supply chains, not to replace or compete with them. As I wrote at the time, the government isn't looking to reinvent the wheel when it comes to the Australia-US defence integration program. The message has been that the wheel needs to spin faster, and that this isn't just about maximising benefits for Australia. In that sense, the Alliance's defence, industrial and technology integration initiatives are also closely tied to the expanded force posture initiatives announced at AUSMIN last year, particularly the combined logistics, sustainment and maintenance enterprise to support high-end warfighting in the region. This too is intended to better integrate Australian and US defence forces, but it also raises questions and concerns around Australian sovereignty, especially for the everyday layman, because of the sight of US bombers or Marines operating from Australian shores is far more tangible for most Australians than obscure debates about supply chains and technological intellectual property. But in both cases, knowing exactly what degree of sovereignty Australia seeks over different capabilities or inputs into a shared defence industrial ecosystem will be critical if we are to maximise our efficiencies and ask for the right things at the right time for the right returns from the United States. Even if we have a blanket concept like bounded sovereignty, it's likely that the sovereignty equation will vary from capability to capability. Take the submarines, for example. Does sovereignty look like building these boats here in their entirety minus the reactors? Does it look like maintaining these vessels exclusively in Australian shipyards or on Australian soil? Does it look like manufacturing and supplying all of the armaments or the supporting capabilities like the XLAUVs without US help? And can ITAR be streamlined enough to make this tenable? What about the advanced capability suite? Does sovereignty mean the head-to-toe development of hypersonic or counter-hypersonic capabilities here in Australia, for example? What about things like Loyal Wingman? What does sovereignty look like for that? What about the intangibles like AI and software applications and quantum? These are not easy questions, and I don't mean to be frivolous by posing so many of them right at the end of my talk here today. But these are questions that the US Studies Centre will be seeking to address next year in a new program of work. So this isn't a complete cop-out on my part. And with that final plug, I will say thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Tom, thank you very much for those the thought-provoking insights. Quite clearly, AUKUS is more a marathon than a sprint, and that even though we're coming out of the consultation phase, meant to be, that a lot of the consultation is very much in-house at this stage, and hopefully that those looking at are looking at some of those very challenging questions that you've posed, not only the ones at the end. I just very quickly thank you for giving us the presentation.